of our church is to build disciples who represents Jesus to everyone, everywhere, with everything. And so what that means in short is that we believe that Jesus makes a difference in life and in everyday life issues. And so one of the key issues that we had a heartbeat on, and I'm sure a lot of churches have, is the area of mental health, especially during this kind of stage 4 restriction lockdown. And so through a friend, I just connected with Dr. Danny Cheah. And so we're kind of doing a whole series of events. So from this morning, the topic of mental health during a crisis. Now, how many of you guys found that helpful? Yeah? Yeah? It's really good. Super awesome. And I'm sure he's dumbed it down for us in so many ways. And then now we're doing a webinar. And so we're going to have a bit of a chunk of Q&A. And part of it is we want to make it and contextualize it to help those who are actually in need as well. And then in the 2 p.m. in our Chian channel, in the YouTube of our church, which is our Chinese service, he's actually going to be doing and speaking a topic on building resilient families. And so that's going to be in English, but translated in Mandarin. So it's also accessible to you as well at 2 p.m. And you can look at it later down the road or whatever. And so in the meantime, I just want to give a bit of an outline of what is going to happen today. So today, Danny's going to talk about to the topics on specific issues around for healthcare workers, for parents, as well as for youth. Yeah. So he'll address some of the practicalities around those specific groups of people. And then after that, we're going to have a whole bunch of Q&A. So my suggestion is, as you're listening to him, or even if you had questions from the talk this morning, put your questions in the chat. Yeah. So there's a chat function at the bottom for those who are not familiar with it. Just go in there, type your questions. And then what will happen after the 15-20 minute presentation, Pastor Carl and myself will take one question each and we'll triage those questions. So I just want you to know we won't be able to get through everything, but we gave enough time for us to be able to get through as much as we can. So if we don't get through everything, don't be offended. And secondly, if some of the questions we ask you to put there, sometimes it can come across a little bit personal, or it can implicate certain individuals that we may know. And so Pastor Carl and I will kind of triage those things that we think is appropriate for this platform of Q&A. So if we do skip those questions, you'll understand why. Yeah. Now towards the end, we'll do a bit of a wrap up, and then many of you will have received in your email already a quick survey. And so we ask you after this webinar, when you hop off, please just fill it in. It just takes a few minutes. It just helps us to know how to do more and more of these events and what's helpful for you. And then also there's a handout that summarizes a lot of what Pastor Dr. Danny Cheah is speaking on. So there's a handout there available for you as well. Now, and after this webinar as well, we're really wary that some of us might be actually going through some mental health challenges. And so we actually want to pray for you. So there is a link. So Sharon's going to put that link, a Zoom link, in the chat right now. And we want to encourage you to hop onto that after this webinar. And then Pastor Kyle and Sharon will be there praying for you as well. And then I'll hop on a little bit later after I kind of manage everything else with that. Sound good? Awesome. Okay. Well, why don't I introduce Dr. Danny? For those who are not familiar, you would have heard that he's a child and adolescent psychiatrist working as the head of clinical services at the Alfred Hospital Child and Youth Mental Health Services in Melbourne. Now, to put it simply, he's at the top of the chain, one of the guys at the top of the chain, and he oversees about 70 medical practitioners in this field. So he's super, super qualified, yeah? Even though, you know, he won't actually say it out loud. And so he goes to Numa Church as well, Christian, and I love the way you presented the biblical lens into it, Danny. And so that's just a quick intro. Why don't I just hand it to you? I'm sure everyone wants to listen to you. So.
Thanks, Pastor Cheah, for such a warm and generous welcome, and to Sharon and Pastor Kyle for this session, and also a big thank you to all the volunteers or staff that you've got that actually make these events happen. There's a lot of work that goes behind the background to make this platform's accessible to you. To a bit, I don't know all of you, but I just want to say thank you to everyone who puts a lot of work into making things happen and allowing us to connect in through these creative sort of platforms. I'll just jump into it. I've got some slides to share to get us started, but I really want to spend actually a lot more time in the Q&A. So I'm just going to cover a few general principles, speaking into a few different groups, and then hopefully spend the majority of the time answering questions and thinking about practical applications. So just connecting on from the presentation or the talk during the service, I just wanted to, I guess, speak to three different groups. Firstly, around healthcare workers working during this period of time, and with the various things that you're encountering, speaking to parents and carers and families, but also speaking to young people. And I'll explain shortly about why it's so important to identify these three groups. First of all, so I'm a healthcare worker. Obviously, I'm working during this time, being a public tertiary mental health service. So we are still running business as usual. We're obviously putting in a lot of precautions, wearing masks and shields and everything. So I'm actually wearing a face mask and a shield doing counseling with a 6-year-old. So this is what things have shifted and turned in terms of what's going on at the moment. But obviously a lot of other healthcare workers are, in terms of nurses and doctors working in emergency department, you know, in aged care and healthcare, obviously in the very front line of meeting lots of different people face to face because it's essential care, GPs and other medical and allied health professionals as well, whether it's physiotherapists and others, pharmacists, you know, continue on this work at the moment. And while in some ways we are privileged in terms of this is a busy time for us and there's job security for us working as healthcare workers, there's a lot happening in terms of what we have to confront in terms of our own fears, anxieties, and worries around the information that we have to try and manage, the multiple changes that happens in the workplace. So every day I'm getting another email from the CEO about a new PPE guideline that we have to put in place and that influences our practice. So there's a lot of things happening. Other areas is that sometimes you might be working long hours, being quite exhausted. The stress at the workplace can actually consume your mental and emotional and practical time and space as well. But also, you know, that there's legitimate fears around kind of bringing things into your own home in terms of coronavirus and so forth. Fortunately, our numbers are coming down in Victoria, but I just still want to speak to some of these worries and anxieties. First thing, I think it's so important when you speak to somebody who's very busy, very committed, spending long hours, asking someone to take a break just sounds like you're speaking French to them. And but it's such an important practical thing, even to be able to take a 5-minute break during your day. And sometimes if you can't find a space because there's, you know, you're working in an environment that you can't even be by yourself, just go to the bathroom or something. Actually, physically taking a 5-10 minute break can be such a huge thing. The other thing is also at the end of my day, because I'm spending a lot of time on screens and on computers, and actually I've got people talking to me and asking me questions all day. At the end of the day, when I come home, I actually just sit down in my bedroom, turn off all the lights in a dark, quiet room, just to kind of tune out, listen to some music for just 5 minutes, going out for a walk around the block. So I guess sometimes it feels like we've got major stresses and problems, but actually what we need to engage in is actually very simple, practical solutions to start with. Obviously, that's not going to solve all the problems, but it starts from some of the small things that we can be doing in terms of our self-care. So being able to, you know, put on your own oxygen mask before you put on an oxygen mask for someone you're caring from. So it's really important for us to be focusing on our self-care, trying to avoid unhealthy habits. Sometimes, you know, when you're exhausted, you're time poor, you just want to kind of do various things to just get through and make yourself feel better. But it's really important for us to try and maintain as much as a healthy routine as well. And obviously we are in this profession because we're committed, we feel called to help others. It's part of, you know, you wouldn't be in a healthcare profession if you actually didn't care for people. And so sometimes we actually perhaps lay down our lives and put others first. But even more importantly, this is the time to be able to tune into actually our own needs and our own self-care. Another thing that I tend to see happen in the workplace is there's a lot of frustration as a result of all the change. People get annoyed, angry, people post things on social media, this should happen. And there's a lot of information out there around, perhaps, the government is not doing enough, and the hospital's not doing enough, and your employer's not doing enough. But I think it's really important for us to perhaps pause from that a little bit. While a lot of the concerns might need to be legitimately problem solved, at an individual level, there are things that we can actually do to be able to manage ourselves from that. And the first thing is actually be able to recognize that throughout a season of change, we're actually experiencing grief and loss. So as a professional, we're not able to do things the same way that we used to do. We have had to pivot, we've had to change. So with any kind of change, even healthy change and growth, comes a sense of loss and grief. So it's actually okay to be able to say, I feel sad that I can't do things the same way I used to do. I feel a bit powerless and helpless. Actually, I found it really helpful because, for example, in my workplace, we have regular reflective sessions. So as a team, we sit down and actually talk about actually not just about the problems that we're facing or the problems we have to solve. Everyone just goes around in a Microsoft Teams chat actually saying, how do you feel at the moment? What's going on for you? So I was able to say, I actually feel sad that I have to see a child wearing all this stuff. I feel really sad. I can't travel and go to conferences and do things that I used to do. I feel sad that I can't do some of the things that I used to do, but these are also things that I'm grateful for. So being able to have that balanced perspective of being able to tune into our own feelings, but also being able to think about the things that we're grateful for. Another thing is also that it's really important, similarly, that we don't go FOMO or compare our success and achievements. Similarly, don't compare actually our sadness and grief. Just because you're not personally in a disaster where you've lost a loved one through death, for example, it doesn't mean that the challenge that you're facing is any less important. So being able to give dignity to your own feelings and challenges as a healthcare worker. Yes, maybe you haven't encountered things that other people might have in terms of losing jobs and so forth. And obviously we want to be grateful and positive and do all those things that are helpful for our mental health. It's also important to be able to acknowledge and give dignity to some of the feelings that we might have about our own circumstances and being very real about that. The next group I want to speak to, and there's actually a lot more that's actually covered at the 2 p.m. Chinese service. So I encourage you to tune into that. I won't go through some of the details, but really want to kind of hone in on perhaps one take-home point. I know for parents and families, obviously, there's a lot of information being shared today, and maybe you need to kind of replay it down the track and just to digest it. But and generally, when you listen to a talk, you walk away with one point that you can put into practice. And obviously, there's lots of things we can learn and encourage each other about today. But just this one point, I think, for parents and families. Parents spend so much time actually trying to do the best for their children with all that they've got, whether it's financial, practical resources, and doing the best that they can. And sometimes when you are a parent, you could perhaps kind of do that to the detriment of yourself. So similarly to what I was speaking to about self-care for healthcare workers. And there's so much out there in terms of the 10 tips to be a best parent, how to raise your child. There's so many books and resources, and sometimes the information can be very overwhelming. The one thing that actually makes the biggest difference in terms of your child's emotional, mental health, resilience long-term is this idea of shared delight. Being able to enjoy the company of your child, and for your child to enjoy your company and to be able to share that joy is probably the one thing that it's so important in terms of building resilience and longer term mental health. So obviously other things are important, safety, security, boundaries, communication, all of these other practical things that are very helpful. But sometimes what gets lost is this sense of joy. So sometimes, if remote schooling is getting a bit overwhelming, you've got too many things to deal with, you're feeling that it's really hard to hope, just take a break and actually do something fun together that you actually enjoy. Try to block out the voices in your head that perhaps accuse you on, these are the things you should be doing. Your sister's doing this with their kids, such and such is doing this with their kids, and avoid that sense of comparison, because what I find tends to happen when I support a lot of parents going through mental health challenges for their children is that they're overwhelmed with feelings of guilt. And sometimes when we try and give new ideas, it actually compounds on that guilt. So first of all, really kind of narrowing it down to something really simple around being able to have a shared sense of joy. When you're able to have that sense of shared joy, you'll be able to connect to your own feelings as a parent, rely on your own instincts and intuition, and be able to tune into your children's emotional needs. And when you're able to tune into yourself and to your children's needs, you're then better able to recognize the different feelings and challenges that they might be experiencing at a particular point of time, and find different ways to be able to overcome that through your own resources as well. The third group that I said I wanted to address, and again, I'm covering this in a short amount of time, but really want to open it up for opportunities for question and answers from a few different groups. I guess the issue of identity, of developing identity, is a lifelong journey, but a particularly important one for young people, for adolescents, for youth, for young adults. It's a period of an incredible amount of change where we individuate from our own family backgrounds. We try to get a sense of our sense of self, our interests, our values. We're grappling with so many different ideas as we navigate this journey, trying to engage into to find belonging and connection through our peers and friendship groups, trying to gain acceptance. And so what tends to happen in adolescence is people individuate from their families into a social space or a social group. And we do that through a lot of different ways, whether it's through our sport, through our activities, our interests, our values. It could be politics. It could be a whole range of different things. It could be academics. It could be even through ministry as well. And that we have opportunities to engage and explore and develop in so many different areas as we go through this period in adolescence and in youth. And all these opportunities actually start to shape or form our identity. They help to inform kind of who we are, our preferences, our values, and so forth. But it's so important, I think, to be able to keep in mind that our identity is, first of all, informed by how God sees us, rather than what the circumstances around says about us. So I think it's so important, I think, for us to get our priorities right with, in terms of the things that we're chasing, in terms of friendships, our education, our achievements, our successes, all these things that perhaps represent the fig leaves that I spoke about in the talk early on, and that some of the external things around us in our lives can tend to fall and drop off, particularly during this time, making us quite vulnerable. And also that during this time, we expect that there could be, social and economic impacts, and a lot of young people, actually young adults particularly, are affected during this period, more so than some of the other age groups. And for example, if your work forms very much a significant part of our identity, when your work is impacted or your achievements are impacted, whether it's your worries about your BCE and school and so forth, when all those things are impacted, it can actually expose us. It can actually cause some of those fig leaves to fall off and expose a sense of overwhelming shame, a sense of failure, and so forth. What I want to say is this, and reiterating a point that I made about resilience early on. Resilience isn't about the absence of problems. It's about how we learn from our mistakes and failures and challenges. It's not about actually avoiding them. Sometimes we get conditioned in our mind through perhaps our own experiences in our family, through society, about the importance of achievement, and we get rewarded for achievement. We give awards to people for achieving the best mark or the best performance in sport and so forth, and that will inform some sense of identity. But it's really important that we're able to get that balance and perspective right, so that we have a good work-life balance. We're able to actually prioritize relationships over achievements, and for us to be able to have a perspective that challenges and adversities and so-called failures aren't actually failures, that they are actually opportunities to learn and to grow. The more opportunities you actually have as a young person to go through different challenges and failures, it actually sets you up for better success or mental health and resilience later in life. So for example, if the first time you had to deal with failure was, at the age of 30 or 40, it can actually feel quite catastrophic if you've never had to experience that before. So just keep in mind as a young person, in terms of some of the challenges that you're dealing with, and you are dealing with so much more than actually what I dealt with when I was perhaps somebody in a youth adolescent space, is that the more that you're able to navigate and challenge and be challenged with and learn from, it sets you up for actually better opportunities down the track in being able to navigate different challenges. So I just really want to encourage you to have that perspective when it comes to having challenges. And this is the second thing for young people, is that in the strive for independence, as a society, we often put a lot of emphasis on self-reliance, independence, and being able to do things ourselves. That's what we're all kind of striving for. But true independence comes from actually interdependence. So on one hand, we don't want to be dependent in terms of relying on people for everything in our lives. We want to be able to work out actually what are the things that we can do ourselves, what are the things that we need people to help us with, and what are some of the things that somebody else actually needs to help you with at a particular stage of life. So being interdependent helps us to know what our limitations are, when and who to get help from, and to be able to do that. Being able to reach out and get help is a form of resilience. It's not a form of failure to actually ask for help. So this is another kind of point I want to kind of encourage young people with. And just to wrap that up really, is to emphasize the importance of community and family. Particularly as Christians, we're quite privileged in terms of being able to connect as a church family, for people to accept us as we are, regardless of what walk of life you come from, how many qualifications or not, whether you have any of those things, whether you're rich or poor, from a financial perspective, whatever, however society sees somebody in terms of a sense of success. As a church community, as a family, we are all bound together through the love of Christ, and being able to abide in Christ and being able to abide in community together helps us to be able to navigate the ups and downs of life, and really encourage you are able to keep connected as a church family and do what you need to do, what you can do to help support each other during this particular point of time, because it is connection that's actually going to help us to get through very tough times. I might kind of pass it back to Pastor Cheah and Pastor Carl and spend a bit more time with the Q&A today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Danny, I'll call you Danny.
Just call me Danny. Yeah.
I'll call you Pastor Dr. Danny.
Yeah. Nobody calls me Danny at work except at churches. People call me Dr. Danny, and a few pastors have accidentally introduced me as pastors over the last few weeks. So I hope it's not prophetic, because it's too scary for me.
So we can swap our titles. I'll be called Doctor and you called Pastor. Now, hey, look, I really appreciate a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, because you're not just going through like, here are the 8 things you can do kind of thing. You've kind of raised a lot of underlying dynamics that's at play, like the issues of resilience, the way we uphold with dignity the place of emotions and feelings. Like there's a lot of things that you kind of raised underneath it. Yeah. And so I guess being the host, can I throw in the first question? Especially around COVID-19, what are the common fig tree leaves that have fallen, and what has it exposed? What are the common things that you're seeing has been exposed, especially during this COVID-19 time, that affects mental health, obviously?
Yeah. There's actually a number of different things. Firstly, and I guess in terms, what I was indicating early on with the talk in terms of thinking about COVID-19 and the pandemic in isolation is that different people are actually affected at varying degrees, because all our fig leaves are actually different. The things that we use to kind of manage our mental health on a day-to-day basis is so different. For example, in terms of personally how I manage my work-life balance, in terms of the work that I do, because I actually spend a lot of time hearing people's stories, their trauma, their challenges and difficulties, and helping them with that. So one of my self-care strategies is actually traveling regularly. At the start of the year, I book as many holidays as I can afford or be able to do with the leave that I have, so that I've got a plan throughout the year in terms of how I can actually be away from my workplace. And that's actually how I manage my mental health in terms of my work-life balance. And obviously it's so different for different people, but for me, that has been the greatest impact in terms of not being able to use something that I have to rely on. So being able to, having to shift um, from some of the things I've been used to finding new ways to actually manage my own self-care and well-being and mental health during this time. For the majority of people, I think the social economic impacts have been very significant in terms of jobs, financial stresses, but apart from that, the uncertainty of the future is actually a huge part. I think there's so much that is put out there in terms of this is a global disaster, a lot of these things are going to happen. And so I don't want to be naive to the severity of the challenges and problems in the moment. It's really important to not not underplay the significance of what we're all going through at the moment, particularly in terms of the socio-economic impacts. But it goes back to one of the things that I actually want to encourage people to do is kind of focus on things you can do and be able to differentiate the things you can and can't control. So we actually can't control things in the future, but we can have control over what we decide to do today in terms of our day-to-day mental health and self-care. So I really encourage people to be able to identify that difference. Obviously keep informed, you need to know the facts, but perhaps not be so consumed about this, panic about this future, about what life might be. We've seen people gone from panic buying toilet paper to panic buying all sorts of groceries and things, and there's a lot of panic over everything at the moment, which really comes from this sense of uncertainty, and people are just trying to grapple with the idea of certainty. And in some ways, this is actually exposing a lot of things that we perhaps hold that gives us in some ways a false sense of security. Because the things that we can be assured in this world is what the Bible tells us. So the truth of God, the truth of God's word, his promises, and all the things that have stood the test of time throughout history and prophecies for the future, that is our basis and the foundation of our certainty and our hope, not actually what's going to happen tomorrow in terms of which cafe is going to open and close tomorrow. So that would be one area. And I guess the other area, I think in terms of perhaps even, for example, with schools and other things, is that people are worried about the future of their children because they're not able to engage in education. They're not able to perhaps do all the things that they need to do. They're missing out on a lot of opportunities. And while obviously that's concerning, I don't want to underplay how important going to school is. I'm a child psychiatrist. I'm always encouraging and supporting parents to get their children back to school. That's what I do all the time. But going back to what I was saying earlier, in terms of, if you look at the big picture, what's important is actually the sense of shared delight and relationship. That's the one thing you can focus on now that's going to invest in terms of, I can tell you for certainty that investing in shared delight with the company of your child, that's going to give you assurance for the future in terms of their emotional and mental health well-being, more than how many classes they attend on remote schooling. Don't tell the education department this, but because I support a lot of parents who are struggling with remote learning, I've told some of them, just maybe skip a few classes, just go to the backyard and have a game instead. Just take it easy. So don't quote me. I don't want to get arrested for telling people to skip school, but really, it's really important to think about what are the priorities right now. And it is about connection and emotions. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but I thought these are some of the common things I get asked in terms of impact of COVID.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's about, like you're saying, it's not just going through difficult things. It's just learning, listening to what this is exposing within us, right? And then confronting and dealing with it. Okay, great. I'm going to hand it to Pastor Carl as he goes through the next question.
Yeah, thank you for what you've shared so far. But you keep on talking about leaves dropping from plants and fig leaves dropping. And for those of us that loves plants, hearing about your leaves dropping causes me a lot of mental anguish. So we'll have to have a few sessions after this. But something that you did mention during your session in the service, you said something along the lines of finding positive outlets, or maybe healthy outlets, I can't remember, but positive outlets to express negative emotions. Could you explain like what that could actually look like, or potentially as opposed to a negative outlet for negative emotions?
Yeah, sure. I think firstly, in order for my plants not to fall, I bought a fake plant from IKEA. So it's made from plastic, so it's not going to shed anytime soon. That's just I am going to get a real plant. It will really brighten up my living room. And I really love your backdrop, Pastor Carl. Going back to that question, I think we get a lot of, we've placed a lot of emphasis in terms of positive and negative, and we think about a lot of things in a very black and white dichotomous way. It's either this or that. And, you know, in some ways, I guess I'd like to, the analogy I would think about is that we're actually not a battery in terms of there's a positive and negative end of us. That actually we are made up of all sorts of different emotions. And sometimes we connect feelings like joy or happiness or excitement or motivation as being positive. And then we connect other feelings like sadness or fear or anger as negative. What I would put to this kind of, I guess, paradigm really is that there are no positive and negative feelings. We just have feelings. We have a range of different feelings that we use to communicate and connect with another person. Feelings are a necessary mode of survival. So that would be the first point I want to make about that. I guess what makes it positive or negative is actually about how we deal with it. So it's our use and misuse of it that's actually negative. So for example, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being angry, and I would kind of defer to you guys as pastors to speak to the theology of that. But you know, our actions as a result of angry feelings can sometimes be the negative things. So for example, slamming the door or being aggressive and so forth, that's actually a negative behavior. But really being able to think about anger as perhaps a feeling rather than a positive or negative one, and being able to give it dignity, being able to express it through words or creative medium. And it's so important for us to have our feelings acknowledged by someone. So the whole purpose that we have feelings is not just for us to feel. What tends to be the need is for someone else to connect with our feelings and for us to feel like that feeling is reflected on and reflected back to us. So in some ways, one of the challenges in mental health or emotions is when we're stuck with our own feelings, anger, sadness, and fear, and we bottle it up, and we actually don't have a healthy way of expressing that. And expressing that is not just about feeling it ourselves, it's actually about the need to communicate that to another human being, for that other person to be able to acknowledge those feelings and share that back to us. So for example, if I'm feeling angry, the other person will kind of be able to say, oh gee, that feels really hurtful, and I can sense your anger. Being able to say that back to me helps me to feel that my feelings matter, and that gives dignity to my feelings, and that's a way to actually help manage mental health problems from getting worse, but also helping us to be able to experience a whole range of different feelings in a healthy way.
Yeah, and that's great. I think that's helpful because sometimes we belittle those feelings to support people's mental health. You shouldn't feel that way. Or maybe you should start focusing on all the things that you should be grateful for. Like it just undervalues those emotions, and you know. Okay, next question. Could you comment on how parents can be more intentional with building resilience in their children whilst acknowledging our cultural influences that affect parenting styles, and how this may be balanced with identity in Christ first?
Yeah. Thanks for whoever asked that question. I think I'm going to cover a lot more of that in detail in the afternoon session that I've engaged in with the Chinese congregation, but just to speak to a few different principles. There's a lot of different ideas out there in terms of building resilience, and you need to do this, you need to do that. There's all sorts of strategies and ideas that get informed by different perspectives, and all very good ideas. It's important to be able to engage in that. But I guess the one thing that I feel that's most important is being able to connect with our own feelings. So if you're a parent, doing whatever you can to be actually emotionally present for your child. So being able to not just focus on the next thing that you need to do. So obviously, it's a lot of things that's a rush. You need to get them ready for school. You need to get things organized. You need to get on with your day. But actually just being able to enjoy the moment of being present with your child. So that's probably the one thing that I think that's particularly important. So for example, if you want to teach your child to unpack the dishwasher, giving them a chore and a task, while it seems like that's teaching independence and responsibility and contributing to the household, unpack the dishwasher together with them. So it's the time and spent together that's really important. The second thing really is that we've been very conditioned to reward positive behavior. So if you do this, you will get this. And sometimes we spend a lot more emphasis on that than actually building relationships. So being able to have time that you can enjoy with your children in an unconditional way, regardless of whether they are so-called good or bad, whether they have been able to do the homework or do not do the homework. So it's important to, obviously you want to reward positive behavior, but it's important that your relationship is not contingent on whether you're good and bad. In the same way that our relationship with God is unconditional in the way that He loves us, whether we have done something right or wrong. One of the principles that I've been able to, I'm trying really hard to engage in my personal life is actually observing the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath is not just a place of rest for us as Christians, but the Sabbath is also a day where we can actually enjoy God's presence, and He loves us even though we produce nothing. So this is a way for us. This is something I've kind of learning for myself in terms of my own self-care and enjoyment, because I think we get we're very kind of production kind of obsessed as a society and producing more things and being efficient, but really being able to observe the Sabbath has been really helpful for me in terms of being able to enjoy a space and time on a regular basis, to know that my God loves me even though I produce nothing.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I guess I'm hearing you sort of say a similar thing through a lot of different answers, which is this emphasis on relationship and connection, which can be really hard to do, especially in this task-based sort of society. Education is task-based, like our sort of everything revolves around tasks and timelines and everything. But yeah, you keep sort of re-emphasizing relationship, connection, sort of understanding each other's emotions and feelings, which is, I guess, really hard for us at times, but it's in the long term incredibly beneficial. We have a really good question, and I'm not sure if it has a simple answer, but I think it's something that a lot of people would be wondering, which is early signs of mental illness. Is there something that maybe we should be aware of in us, and maybe aware of in the people around us, and maybe what then do we do about that, as a bit of a follow-on, I guess?
Yeah, so I guess I would simply put it by thinking about mental health difficulties as, feelings, behaviors, and thoughts, and where I guess it impacts on our life in a significant way. So first, a few different principles that helps to think about, is this kind of a mental health difficulty or just life stress? One is actually the severity of it. So how much of it is impacted in your life in terms of your work or your study, your routines, your ability to connect with people, in terms of your sleep and your appetite. So how much of the impact will be the severity or impact would be the first thing. The second thing is that it's in terms of time frames and how enduring is the problem. So it's just happening kind of once off. It happens for a few days and you bounce back, or is this actually kind of going on for actually a number of weeks? Because if it's enduring, that would be another reason to actually try and seek professional help or be able to understand certain things. It's particularly difficult at the moment because we're in lockdown, and this idea of whether it's just enduring or not, it feels a bit uncertain. So I think that's a bit that can be a bit challenging for us to try and work out in this particular season. But generally, severity and the enduring nature of it will be the two key principles that help to guide. The third thing that I want to say to this is that when we're unsure about something, it's best to actually talk it through with somebody, and this is why being connected with community is helpful. Often people can observe things that we don't realize ourselves. When people are struggling with mental health challenges, whether it's commonly depression and anxiety, often it's the people around us that realize it or notice signs before we actually realize ourselves, because we're caught up in our own thoughts and feelings. Sometimes we feel that it's awkward in terms of being able to say some things like that to someone. If we point it out, someone might feel offended and so forth. So I think it's important to be able to leverage that relationship, being able to do that in a loving way, and being able to actually hold each other account, and that we actually are responsible for checking in on people. Hey, how are you doing? Don't start off the conversation by going, oh, are you mad? Start off with kind of, how's school going? How's your family going? And just checking in on someone, and make that our usual kind of practice. That then helps us to actually gonna go, oh, I've noticed this happening. I just wanted to just check in with you to make sure you're okay. And sometimes to be able to externalize it, my pastor told me to check in on everybody in my Connect group. Sometimes, it just gives you a bit of permission to actually say something like that. And it opens up conversations, and people actually appreciate someone actually taking notice that something is different. Sometimes the immediate reaction, the person could be offended or angry, but actually once they think about it, they will really appreciate someone reaching out. So being connected, having other people notice it would be helpful. And I guess
I'm gonna say Pastor Cheah said that you've been acting weird and I need to talk to you. That's my in. Yeah.
That was
I got an email from Pastor Cheah to check in on you because you've been a bit weird.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of checking out, there's a lot of access to resources, both online, there's counselors through schools, your GPs. We're actually quite fortunate in Australia to have a reasonably well-resourced mental health system. In fact, the mental health care in Australia is actually one of the best in the world. In terms of, so I've had opportunity to speak in the US, and I've been to the UK for different training and so forth, but our mental health care actually is one of the best in terms of resourcing. So there is opportunities to access that, and in terms of costs and all those sort of things aren't necessarily huge barriers. But it goes back to the issue of stigma. So if we have a lump in our neck, and we think maybe, this could just be, something temporary, might just go away, or it could be something more sinister, we generally would go and see a GP and get it checked out. We wouldn't kind of just sit there and wonder whether it's severe or not severe. So similarly with mental health difficulties, when you're actually having doubts, going to see a professional to get it checked out, even to get reassurance, is actually a good step, because it helps to alleviate your anxiety, and you can then get on with the things that you need to do. Or you might get pointed out to have a certain kind of help to be able to address your challenges and difficulties. So it goes back to, I think, how we view it in terms of how important we see it, but also the stigma that perhaps stops people from being able to have a conversation about it, or even kind of get help for it when we need to.
Yeah, that's great. No, thanks for that. I'll go to the next question, which I think is very, very common. It says, if you know someone with clinical depression and they're reluctant to access professional mental help, how can you encourage them to do so?
There's a few things. One, I think when people are reluctant to get help, they're not just being difficult. It's important for us not to label people with some of those ideas. They're being difficult, they're in denial. These are common words that I think that we label people with, and I've done it, unfortunately, in my own profession as well. But it's really important to realize that people might struggle to get help or recognize things. There are often two reasons. One, they don't understand, and they're actually afraid or scared. So first of all, think about, what is it like to be confused and not understand things? And second of all, what does it feel like to be afraid and scared? And that will help you then to navigate what the next steps might be. Some of the next steps could be giving someone just general information. Here, this is something that I've connected with in my church. This is some resources. This is some information. Why don't you have a look at it? Don't start off a conversation with, I think you need to do this. Start off by saying, I read this, I looked at this, and I found it helpful. This was interesting to me. That's a very good conversation starter in terms of being able to engage someone and being able to gently give information to help improve someone's understanding. The next thing is, depending on the level of relationship you have with that person, if you have a closer relationship, then you'll be able to say things actually and reflect that feeling. I know that sometimes when people go through challenges, you can actually be feeling quite afraid. Can I help you with that? And see where that conversation leads. So that would be the other kind of next step. And the third thing is, regardless of how those conversations go, it's really to keep in mind that all of us are fundamentally similar as human beings, and we have similar needs, whether you have mental health difficulties or not. And that is that we all want to feel loved, we want to feel that we belong, and we want to feel like we matter. So if there are things that we can actually do to help people feel like they're loved, they're cared for, that they belong, that they matter, then that's a really good way to build trust and relationship, to then have all these other strategies and conversations around whether addressing specific mental health issues. And often we are very quickly to judge the behavior and look at what's on the outside. And so the behavior, as I said, like for children, it's the same for adults. So how someone presents in the outside, actually, it's a form of communication of how they might feel inside, and tap into the feelings that might be inside.
Yeah, no, that's great. Because I think sometimes as the one who wants to help, we try and force ourselves that line. We kind of force ourselves because we want to help people, and that's where it can go wrong in the way we communicate and empathize with people. Yeah. Just as a continuation, because I think that would be helpful for a lot of us who are trying to help others who are in this journey. Oftentimes I can hear the comment that you just don't understand. You just don't understand. And how do we approach that then? When people feel like we don't understand their situation, you've never been through a mental health issue and all that kind of stuff. Like, what can we do?
Yeah, there's a number of different things. I think, first of all, as a church community, the fact that you're highlighting this conversation, you've got a series on a whole different topics in terms of relationships, and I think that in itself opens up opportunities that reduces the stigma. Also, it's helpful when leaders, pastors, role models are able to speak out about their own experiences, because it just helps to dispel the myths and stigma when that happens. So that creates a sense of security. So one, at an individual level, people need to feel brave to be able to speak out and to understand that reaching out for help is a form of resilience, not failure. That would be at an individual level. At a community level, it's the things that we can be doing in terms of helping to reduce that stigma. First of all, a lot of things that we do unintentionally that make it unsafe for people to speak up about mental health. Sometimes it could be, often as Christians, we rarely say things that are perhaps hurtful intentionally. I hope not anyway. But often it's the things that we do unintentionally, that the eye roll. How many of us have done that before, in terms of when someone is a bit different in our group, we might kind of exclude certain people from some of the things that we want to do. So it's really important that we create an atmosphere that we're inclusive of people as much as possible in our day-to-day. And that community of inclusion, would that make it safe for anyone to be part of that, in order for people to feel safe to speak out about mental health, and obviously at a broader kind of level as a community, being able to have role models speak out actually carries more weight than a professional like me giving people education about their mental health. So if you're a parent, especially if you're a father here as well, being able to talk about your feelings and challenges and to model that actually helps to create an environment of safety and inclusion.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're getting a few questions about some kids and identity ones, which we might jump into in a second. But there was just one that was sent through that I thought was a really good question. And it said, Are there any particular age groups which are significantly impacted by mental illness? But can I also maybe rephrase that and say, are there any particular like life stages that are particularly or significantly impacted by mental health issues?
Yeah, sure. So obviously mental health issues affect the entire lifespan, whether you're young or you're old. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that no one's particularly necessarily immune to it or excluded from this statistic or what we know about mental health challenges. 75% happen, if you look at all mental health conditions across the lifespan, if you track back about when things started, 75% of it actually starts before the age of 25. And so this is why I'm particularly passionate about, as a child adolescent psychiatrist, being able to help people early on in the process, helping people with different adversities and challenges early on, so that it helps them to perhaps get onto a different course later in life. So I would say 75%. And then out of that 75%, so if you put, 50% actually occur between the age of 12 to 25. So that would be the other kind of group. But if you look at 75%, it would be 0 to 25. In terms of mental health challenges tend to happen in periods of significant change and transition. So the reason I think this happens for young people is because every stage of life, every day is a significant day of change and transition for a young person growing up. So you might have to have it, whether it's about moving on from primary school to high school, so different kind of milestones that we reach tend to be a marker of some of those changes. So I guess there's always constant flux and constant change. Some of the period times of stresses could be moving out of home. That could be your first challenge in terms of developing your independence and try to manage for yourself. But for some, it's actually a form of relief and escape. So other kind of things is really when there are very significant impacts in terms of the things that actually matter a lot to us. So loss of a job is a very significant one. Loss of a loved one is also very another kind of significant impact, and also health conditions, that then impact our ability to function in a significant way. Those are some common challenges that someone might go through, that kind of perhaps mark a period of significant change, significant grief and loss. So really anything that has a sense of grief and loss attached to it can perhaps make us more vulnerable in terms of mental health. Some of the other areas would be around kind of major movements, moving house, moving cities. And it's not actually about the movement and relocation, it's actually a disconnection from your community during that time that's actually the most significant. So I've had to move. So I was from Malaysia, then I moved to Tasmania, and I moved around a few times, and I moved to Melbourne eventually. What was really helpful for me is that because I play keyboard, piano and keys in my church, and I've been doing that since youth group days. And being able to do something like that just helps me to connect with people instantly. So whenever I move to a new place, I join a community, join a life group. And sometimes actually I contact the church before I move to find out what's available, try to make connections. And as soon as I arrive, I've got an instant community. So I make that a priority in my life, because I know that changes and transitions can feel quite isolating for a lot of people as well. So I guess amidst all those different life journeys, I guess I just want to emphasize the importance of connection in a community, and making sure that we are prioritizing that.
So,
Yeah.
oh, sorry to jump in.
Okay.
I'm just sort of like putting a few pieces together. Like you've mentioned that, hey, it's really good to actually go through some form of struggle early on in life, because you actually build up that understanding of what struggle is, and that failure isn't always a bad thing. Like, there's learning involved, and you sort of talk about the value of struggle early on, but then you've also talked about, I guess, the higher risk factor of mental illness or mental health issues at an early age. So there's probably that balance that needs to occur of like putting children in a place where they can learn and experience things, but also providing support structure and care. So I guess a question that I'm wondering, and it has come through on a couple private chats, is if you believe that your adolescent, your child, has some things that maybe you are unequipped to deal with, or you just don't know how to deal with, what are some of the steps that you would take in terms of potentially getting them to see a professional? Like, are there recommended paths? Is it something that, hey, let's try and work this out at home, and then the next step is, hey, let's see maybe a friend who has some experience, and then the next step is this? Or yeah, like if you think you're struggling with a child at home who has some of these issues, what would you recommend a step being in that?
Sure. Before I go, I just forgot one important point about the major transition. Another point of
Yep.
a major change transition is actually for older people, whether it's through retirement and also perhaps loss of a spouse and through sickness and so forth, because that really causes a major shift in terms of connection, identity, belonging, and also significant grief and loss. So it's really about being for an older person who's retiring, making sure that there are ways that you remain connected and find different ways to pivot in terms of the finding new fig leaves in your life, so to speak, in terms of a different season, and to be able to manage that as well.
Yep.
So going back to in terms of seeking help for children, I think whether or not you've got additional challenges and an average parenting stresses, it's important to keep in mind that the idea of the resilience, emotional connection, they all apply whether or not you have additional challenges or not. There's a website called raisingchildren.net. I'm happy to share some of these resources and tools by email to Pastor Sheen, and maybe you can circulate that around if you like. But if you just go to raisingchildren.net, thank you. That's an Australian parenting website. It's a very useful platform that covers a whole range of different tips for different age groups, so infants, toddlers, primary school age kids, adolescents, young people. If you're parenting a child with additional needs, it's a really great, useful platform for some practical tips and ideas and how to manage things, but also it gives some advice about when to kind of get additional help as well. Some other common ways of doing that, so if you've got a very young child, your GP, pediatrician, or your maternal child health nurse are often really great resources in terms of being able to do the initial screening and then getting some practical help as well in terms of helping to track development as well as understanding their mental health needs. And you know, sometimes the earlier you attend to things, the better it is. So, you know, if you're a parent of a child, say, you know, age 0 to 3, apart from the usual health checks that you go with the maternal health, child health nurse around development, how tall, how big they are, how much they weigh, the nurses are also trained to check on their development, their emotional, social skills, and sometimes they might be able to give advice about the things that you can be doing at that stage. And also then getting help early on with early intervention if that's needed. So if you've been given advice by someone to get help, then don't put it off, because the earlier you get help, in some ways, the less help you will need over time, particularly in that early age. All schools have well-being counselors, and often that could be another point of contact. So having regular communication with your school. A lot of parents might feel afraid to actually raise issues with the school because they're worried of the child being signaled out or stigmatized and so forth. But the school does have a responsibility around children's emotional well-being, and most schools are actually quite well equipped in terms of supporting children. There are school counselors, well-being teams. Some schools also have chaplains, and also the government has actually put in a lot of supports for mental health in schools to be able to assist students as well. Come to high school, again, similarly, there are well-being kind of teams and supports as well. Also for the youth group, the 12 to 25 age group, Headspace centers are often a very good place to start. There's I think headspace.org.au. You can find a local center that can help connect for your child and so forth. And there are different tips and resources there, web tools, but also how to kind of link in with a professional as well if you need to. And then obviously another place is through your GP for all age groups, who can help navigate you to a referral point to get mental health support, especially during this pandemic. They've actually allowed for, so usually the government funds 10 mental health counseling sessions. They increased that to 20 for Victorians as a result of the isolation that we're in. So we're quite fortunate to be able to access that help help there as well. So there are lots of different avenues, and I don't want to make it too complicated, but really, you know, your GP or perhaps some of the primary supports that you've got depending on the age of the child. In terms of helping children with mental health challenges and difficulties, this is how we usually do it at my workplace. So somebody might refer a child to see us because there's a particular problem at school or at home with their behavior or learning that's in a significant way. And our approach is to do a bit of an assessment, understand the situation in the family context. We get information about the child, we get information about the family, information about the school, and pull it all together to try and understand what's going on. Because a child doesn't live in isolation. The child lives within a system with siblings, families, schools, and be able to understand the different things that might be going on. Also, in terms of helping a child, through challenges and difficulties, the family is actually the best resource to help children in terms of thriving and recovering. Very rarely we would actually do individual talk therapy with young children. We do a lot more work with parents, supporting schools, or seeing the child together with their family. And we find that actually has the best chance in terms of helping children. So even if your child is reluctant to get help, don't see that as a problem. It's actually a strange experience for a child to go and see a counselor. They won't understand. It's really difficult for them to understand. But what tends to make the most impact actually is the parents going to get help on their child's behalf, as the child's advocate, but also as the child's resource. You see someone like myself once a week, you know, for 40 minutes. The idea is that it's not that I'm going to change the situation for your child. What I'm doing is actually collaborating with parents about how to create an environment that promotes opportunities for recovery. So that's how child and adolescent mental health treatment works. It's actually about collaborating with parents and teachers and caregivers about creating environments to make to allow for children to thrive in whatever challenge that they might be in.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll just ask, only because I'm aware of time, two other questions, and then we'll try and wrap everything up. But questions that I kind of filtered through and I thought was very important and relevant for the majority of us. I think I can relate to you, Danny, to a lot of the stuff that you're talking about with the loss, grief, and all that kind of stuff. I guess with myself, with my wife, you know, I lost my wife through the brain hemorrhage 2 years ago. And at that time I had two kids, right, 4 and 6. And part of the challenge was how do I discern that line? You know, there's that self-care that I needed to do. I actually did that. A healthy grieving promotes a healthy grieving environment for my children, you know, some of that kind of stuff. So that was really helpful. But what's difficult is that line. How do I know that line, to discern that line where like it's just child age kind of issues that they're dealing with versus like mental health issues versus grief kind of thing. I put some of the stuff in place. I sought a counselor and I talked to Judah about it to say, hey, I need someone to talk to. I brought him once or twice so that you can set it up for the future to remove the stigma to seek help, you know, some of the environmental things that you're talking about. But this is one particular question from someone that talks about that line. Yeah. So it says, when your child repeatedly talks about being sad and you make a lot of time as a parent to make space to talk to them and make them feel safe to be heard about their feelings, how do you know how to draw the balance between that and making a possible non-issue molehill for them into a mountain? How do we know if we're not making it a bigger or real problem by actually talking about it too much or every time they raise it, example, every day? Brackets, this is when the child talks about how sad they are every day, at least once or twice a day.
Yeah. I'll speak to this at perhaps a different number of different levels, at an individual level to answer that question, but also at a broader kind of level. You might have heard comments like people saying things like, you know, or mental health issues on the rise, you know, people are actually less resilient, our society's falling apart, and some of those messages that get communicated in that way. What actually is happening is we actually don't know if that mental health issues on a rise in a true sense of form, because we actually don't have something to compare with in the past, because in the past people don't speak up about mental health. So just because people are speaking up about mental health, it doesn't mean that there's a bigger problem. It's actually just being acknowledged, and that's actually a good thing. So for example, even in this current pandemic, where actually, Lifeline has seen a 30% increase in phone calls and support for help. So at one level, we kind of think, oh gosh, that's a problem. But actually, I see that and that's a good thing, because people are actually reaching out for help and asking for help for their challenges and difficulties. So that would be a general principle that I want to kind of start this response with, in terms of speaking out. Actually, it's a good thing, because speaking out doesn't create a problem. It actually perhaps highlight a problem that is already there. Speaking about something it isn't actually isn't the cause of the problem. It's actually the symptom of the problem. So it's a little bit like saying, if you have some other, this is some kind of other health condition. If someone starts complaining about their symptoms, it's not going to cause them to have a heart attack if they already have chest pain, for example. So being able to speak up about your symptoms perhaps is a sign of something kind of going on. It may not necessarily mean that there's something very severe going on, but it simply indicates a form of communication of something that needs to be understood. So often the child may not even understand perhaps why they're sad. They're all just saying they're feeling sad. And so sometimes as a parent, you might, you may find different ways to be able to understand that. But first of all, I think it's important to perhaps to take a step back from this sense of self-judgment, that somehow if your children are sad, that means you're a bad parent. What I find that one of the things that's most crippling for parents to be able to seek help and to tune into things is a sense of self-judgment, feeling like if my children are not thriving and not happy, that means I'm a terrible parent. Because I see so many families that I work with in my professional space, that's a very common theme that parents hold when they see their children upset. So I think, first of all, as a parent, I would encourage you to find a way to overcome and work through that sense of guilt, and be able to reach out for help for yourself, to be able to come to terms with that sense of stigma, and then being able to have that conversation to understand a bit more about what that sense of sadness is. What I was saying earlier around the example of anger, for example, and what the feelings might be underneath, is that often fear, sadness, and anger are actually very deeply connected. So when a child experiences one of those three feelings, it could actually be one of the other two feelings that might be the issue underneath. So if a child's feeling sad, what could be potentially happening is they could be feeling actually scared inside, scared of things like growing up, scared of going to school or some of the challenges at school, scared about life or things in general because of all the news that they've been hearing, whatever that might be. And so when you experience one of those three feelings on the external or on the surface, try and dig a little bit deeper and consider one of the other two feeling options, I guess, in terms of the spectrum of different feelings children might be having underneath. So if someone's saying they're sad, don't just take it at face value and just try and make them happy. What you want to do is try to tap into, are they also feeling scared? Are they feeling angry about change or certain things, and be able to connect all those feelings before jumping into some kind of problem-solving mode.
Yeah, that's great. So what I hear from you is that address yourself first as a parent and how you approach and see that question from the child, and then it postures you to serve them properly, rather than reflect your self-judgment upon them. And then secondly, hear underneath what they mean when they say sad. It could mean a variety of things as well. And it's a symptom of an underlying thing. So, yeah. Now, this has been going on. Thank you, Danny. I just want to have one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up. But, as a church, one of the things that we really believe is that Jesus makes a difference in everything in life. And so just as a really quick question, what difference do you see having faith in Christ makes a difference in the way we approach mental health?
Yeah. I guess one of the most significant for myself is how I make sense of the suffering that we have in this world. So for a lot of people going through mental health challenges, they're experiencing very significant suffering in their life on a day-to-day basis. For some of us going through this pandemic in a moment, this could be the first time you're experiencing stress and mental health challenges in a significant way. But outside this pandemic, there are many people, 1 in 4 people worldwide that actually struggle with significant mental health difficulties, and sometimes in a very enduring day-to-day level. So the idea of suffering perhaps becomes a very big topic now because of what we're all going through, but this exists throughout time and history and so forth. So being a Christian, having a perspective and understanding that actually having a biblical foundation of the truth of how I understand my worldview about the world and God and his character and his goodness, and understanding the context of suffering in the sense of the fallen nature of the world that we live in, but actually the hope that we have through Christ Jesus. That's the thing that makes the absolute difference for me as a Christian working in this field versus somebody who may not, for example. Obviously, there's a lot of good mental health help available regardless, but the thing that helps me in my job really is to understand that ultimately people need Jesus. There is a hope for an eternal life. There is something bigger than what actually I can contribute, and that helps me to make sense of the relentless suffering that I see in the work that I do day to day. And the other thing also, I guess, in terms of at a very practical relationship level, it gives context for our relationship and the purpose of our meaning together. So something I mentioned at the end of the talk earlier this morning was that the hope that we have isn't just about having positive psychology and so forth, but because Christ has died on the cross for us, one of the purpose of communion is to get us to, every time we meet together, to remember that what he has done on the cross. That helps us to understand his sacrifice and the hope that we have in him, so that our purpose for connecting and meeting together every time has meaning and purpose. And so that then when we meet together, even though we have different preferences, we have different views, we do have different political frameworks, we have different things that we like or dislike, and with all that together, what binds us together is actually this hope that we have in Christ Jesus that makes sense for everything that we do as Christians, in the way that we help each other, the way that we love each other. It isn't doing it just to make ourselves feel good for caring for someone else. There is a bigger purpose to understand all the things that we do. And absolutely, for me, it helps me to make sense of the suffering in the world that we see day to day.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Dr. Pastor Danny Cheah. I'm sure that was very, very helpful for a lot of us. And I'm sorry, everyone as well, for those who've asked questions. We weren't able to go through all of them. But we really do thank you for your time. And again, just want to affirm your calling in this area. We have different callings, and oftentimes you're restricted to ministry, church ministry or whatever. But God has called you into this space of in the medical world. At such a time like this, and I love the way you've integrated faith and your vocation and your field of expertise in a very integrated way, and for serving us in this way. Thank you very much. Now, for everyone else, just really quickly, Dr. Danny shared some links and some networks. So what we'll do is we'll capture some of that, and then we'll send it out into the email list so that you can have access to that. Okay. Secondly, we'll also, in that email that you'll receive, is a handout that captures a lot about what he shared about this morning, about some of the practicalities around building mental resilience. Thirdly, after you get off this chat, if you can just check your inbox, it'll just take you a few minutes. Really appreciate if you could fill in the survey for us. It will help us sharpen how we can do this better to serve you. And then lastly, I'm really worried that some of us here might be concerned for someone's other behalf, your children, or even for yourself, in the area of mental health, and if you need prayer. Sharon has actually put the Zoom link in right now. In there is you can click onto that link. Can you just put that in again so it's at the very bottom so that everyone can see it? You can click onto that straight after this, and then Pastor Carl and Sharon will be there, as well as Pastor Greg and the team, to pray for you. But otherwise, can I just close in prayer and then just say thank you? Lord God, we just want to thank you that you're a God who has suffered, but also a God who has been victorious. And I think that is an incredible, unique aspect of our faith in you, Lord, that you're able to sympathize with our every weakness, but yet was without sin. You are our fellow feeler in our lived experience. And I pray especially for those who are struggling in the area of mental health. Lord God, I really pray that that you'll be able to help them see how you are walking with them in this journey. You are empathetic, but not just empathetic, also and empowering and enabling them to take a step forward into a place of freedom and breakthrough as well. So we pray for your blessing upon Dr. Danny. May you continue to use him in an incredible way to bring help to a lot of people, but also to point people to you in increasing measure. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
So click that link for the prayer. Thank you, guys.